Hi Sharon. We st- we still have like 4-ish minutes for folks to roll in. So, Hanaya, Sharon, if either of y'all need to run to the restroom or grab a drink or anything, feel free. And let me go ahead and drop this is the slides for following along today in the chat. Hi, Keisha. Welcome.
Hey, how are you?
I am all right. Hanaya and I were talking about the cold weather lending to some extra tiredness, and personally I have like seasonal affective that kind of kicks in around now, but it's been a decent week actually, and I got some good news yesterday, so doing good. How are you doing?
I'm glad to hear about the good news. I'm doing well. The cold weather, uh, my brain kind of, well, I don't know. I like part of
Uh-oh, is my I can't tell if it's my internet having struggles or if Keisha was breaking up a little bit. Hanaya, were you able to hear the whole way through? Okay, so not just me. Okay, you're driving. Please drive safe. We've got a couple more minutes before we get fully started, for folks to jump in. Ooh. Hanaya, I know you were saying you've been feeling tired. Have you been able to like get any sort of like rest or hibernation at all? And she might have stepped away too. Hi. Mm-hmm. Yeah, understandable. Speaking of second wind, you just reminded me that I need to take my second round of meds for the day. So I'm going to do that real quick before we get started. Thank you for that unintentional reminder. All right, we're hitting right at 5:30. I know Keisha's driving, and a couple of folks will probably be trickling in, like Leslie. Um, but we can go ahead and at least start rolling a little bit. So, I do just want to do a little check-in and see. I know last week, oh, what am I hearing? Oh, that was a DM. Okay. I know last week was a little bit bigger, I want to say, or like more logistical focused kind of than what we have been doing. So just wanted to check in and see like if any new questions had popped up for folks or any new reflections based on last week's content, which we'll also do a recap on, but just wanted to touch base and make space for that.
I don't remember if it was last week or not. I do know that I've still been in a debate over it, if I really am going to base things on finding my people, or however that should be phrased. I I don't really know what that should be because for different uh, for different reasons
Mm-hmm.
that would probably take me going into too much at the start of class.
Yeah. We're going to be talking more about like different groupings of people today too across like the spectrum of supporters and like opponents, etc. So sometime, and we're gonna kind of be taking today our like big picture vision and starting to like narrow it in a little bit based on certain things. So it's possible, not promised, but it's possible that it might um, help like give some more clarity to that ambiguity for you.
Okay.
All right. Hearing nothing else, we can go ahead and roll through to the next slide. Quick housekeeping notes. As per usual, we're live streaming onto Twitch, so if you do not want your voice to be included in the live stream or the recording, as a result of not including it in the live stream, it won't be included in the recording either. Just let me know so that I can mute the output from the app. It's easy to do. I just push a button on my side. And then that said, if we get a couple more folks in, then it might be more important for us to just stay muted so we're not talking, or when we're not talking, so that we're not talking over each other. And then also that said, the recording, as usual, will be posted along with the slides and all the fun follow-up materials to the Teachable website at some point tonight. And yeah, you're welcome to participate by coming off mute and sharing your voice. You can come on video. The Twitch live stream only includes audio from the Discord and then the video that you see from my screen. So no one can see anyone else's video that is not in this Discord group, including the folks who watch the recording. And I think that's it for housekeeping. I'm like got two screens of notes, so I'm just trying to make sure. And then for our time together today, we are going to be doing we start with our normal checking in, then we are going to be talking about strategy as a concept, and we're going to be building out some of the goals based on that first column of the strategic planning chart that we introduced last week. And then we are going to be looking at the order of operations for targeting. And when we wrap up today, we will be wrapping up with talking about one-on-ones as a tool for building relationships within the targeting. But this is all kind of ambiguous right now. It'll become more clear through today's sessions. As a reminder, we only have 2 weeks left. Next week is going to be more about actually mapping power, and that'll take us into week 4, which will be about tactics and timing. And we're going to do get a clearer definition of tactics today as well. So before we hop in to the recap in today's materials, we'd just love to hear a round of check-ins. I think we all have met each other at least once at this point. So if we mostly just want to do a check-in of like 2 to 3 feelings that you're holding today, and then if there's anything in particular that you're really hungry to learn about, and if there's anything that you need from us to show up fully, let us know that too. And Hanaya, do you want to kick us off?
Um, I'm spacing out too much. I'm sorry.
No apologies necessary at all. I know Keisha's driving, so Keisha, if you're in a space where you want to share how you're feeling and what you're eager to learn about today, feel free to come off mute and do that, but also don't feel obligated if it's not safe. I also saw Sharon typing, so I just want to make space for that for a second. And as Sharon types and her check-in, I think we've all heard the community agreements at least once. The quick version is that we just ask when we're here that we're here as much as we can be, whatever that looks like, that we show up respectfully, non-judgmentally, that we challenge ourselves to take up space if we're the kind of folks who typically lean out, and that we challenge ourselves to make space for others if we're the kind of folks who typically lean in. That we try to think of questions that we can ask before we make statements, particularly when we find ourselves maybe feeling like something that we want to argue with or coming to a judgment of some kind. And then also the final agreement just being that it's always a good time to share. So like with your check-in, Hanaya, from last week when you said, I don't remember if this is last week's session or not, that's totally fine because it's never too late to be bringing up thoughts or questions from any part of the course. Got Sharon bringing some positivity, a little anxiety, mostly optimism, and curious what things I don't even know I want to learn yet. I love that. Cool. So for a recap of last week, we learned about the concept of emergent strategy as the introduction to our strategic campaign planning process. And in particular, emergent strategy offers us 6 elements. I kind of think of like 6 containers that we can use to build out campaign strategies. And those elements are fractal, which is a fancy way of referring to strategically planning for the small in order to set intention for the large. And then adaptive is the second one, which is in reference to planning for just the constant change that we face in community organizing. The third element is the element of interdependence and decentralization. So this is about incorporating decision-making and leadership within our campaign and organizing that is modeling decentralization, that is modeling interdependence. The fourth element being the concepts of non-linear and iterative, which is just repetitive essentially. So strategically planning for cycles of repetition and cycles of failure that can be leveraged as learning opportunities that still make progress towards our end goals. The fifth element is the element of resilience, and so this is planning, knowing that we're going to face challenges, losses, pain, hardship, etc., strategically planning for those things. And we build resilience through relationships, so strategically planning for relationships within our organizing campaigns. And then the sixth element being the element of creating more possibilities. So strategically planning to model new ways of being and creating abundance instead of just demanding things from people who are in hierarchical positions of power. And this framework of emergent strategy is directly connected to the 4 R's framework and the just transition frameworks that are 2 kind of like perspectives that can be used to shape our strategies that are just really helpful to think about the kinds of organizing that we want to do. Did you have a question, Maya? Did I hear you?
No.
Okay. Sorry, I don't know what I heard. So the 4 R's framework and the just transition framework are aligned with the concept of emergent strategy because they take into consideration different different means of decentralization, different means of creating possibility. In the 4 R's, it's referred to as the R of recreate. And then finally, we introduced the strategy chart that comes from the Midwest Academy Manual for Organizing, and we started filling out that strategy chart, specifically starting with the first column around outcomes, objectives, and the third column all about people and the spectrum of support and opposition. I'll pause and just see if there's anything that we need to clarify from last week, or if there's any like outstanding questions or thoughts. Cool. Well, it's never too late, so if you think of any, don't hesitate to share. Okay, so to start our time together today, I wanted, as we did with power, and as we did with self-interest, and as we did with organizing, I want us to have a shared definition of strategy. And for strategy, we can think about strategizing as turning what you have into what you need to get what you want. So turning the resources that are available to you into the power that you need to enact the change that we want in order to create the world that we want to see. So the real important thing that I want to emphasize from this definition is that strategy should be thought of as a verb. We don't just come up with a strategy, a strategic plan, and then implement it and everything goes perfectly, or set it down and never look at it again. We are constantly strategizing towards the outcomes that we have identified, and we're adjusting as needed based on shifting resources, based on shifting power dynamics, based on the accumulation of the changes that we want to see. I saw Keisha just popped off, so I bet she is either driving through a bad cell spot or she's arriving at her destination and will join us from a different device. But I'll pause here and get y'all's thoughts or questions about this idea of strategizing as turning what you have into what you need to get what you want.
Right now, it just sounds super vague.
Okay.
I'm being stupid.
Heard. Well, in that case, let's think about how we spent last week really talking about what we want, right? These big, beautiful visions that you all shared of having no borders so that mobility is easily accessible for folks, having a community in which everyone can contribute in a way that brings them joy and they are valued, and there's mutual aid and people ask each other for help, and there's no more burning trash, and everyone has health care, and everyone's able to be who they want to be and all of their identities, this big, beautiful vision. So we've already got sort of the last piece of the concept of strategy in place, being get what you want, right? So we know what we want. So now we have to figure out what we have as far as resources and what we need as far as power. And have to make sure all our allies, my people, want the same thing. Yes, exactly. We're starting to put the puzzle pieces together. So this week is all about turning these big, beautiful visions that we discussed last week into concepts and outcomes with more clarity that we can then plan around in the here and now based on the resources that we have and the power that we need to bring these visions to life. So successful movements plan their strategy on multiple levels. We start with these big, beautiful visions of where we want to be. Then we work backwards to form a roadmap of the entire process. So, for example, if this was a road trip to California, if that's what we were organizing, we would know where we want to go. We want to go to California. But we would also need to know that there's a lot of different routes that we can take to get there. And the route that we choose out of the options that we have, that's our overall strategy. So are we going to start here in North Carolina, hop on I-40 and take that highway all the way out west? Do we have the resources to be able to do that, to even drive on the highway? Or are we going to have to take other means of transportation? Do we need to strategically plan our trip around bus and train routes based on the resources that are available to us? Do we want to take the northern route or the southern route if we drive? Will the time of year impact the decisions that we make? Once we have a good idea of our overall strategic approach, we're going to hop on I-40, we're going to drive the whole thing out to California. We need to know we need to get to California, but we also know that if we're going to get to California, and we're going to take I-40, then our first goal might actually be to make a pit stop at some cool tourist attraction in Tennessee. So then we plan around that strategic goal accordingly. So the campaigns for our strategic goals are the intentional pit stops along the route that we make. A vision of universal health care, a strategy of getting, let's say our strategic approach, the map that we're going to take to get there is we're going to get a federal universal health care implemented. We might have strategic goals along the way by making sure that all 50 states have Medicaid expansion passed. Maybe a strategic goal of having healthcare cooperatives formed in a certain number of states. And these are the intentional pit stops along our route to that universal healthcare. And then the individual tactics are the individual actions, the necessary steps to achieve that goal, to reach that strategic goal and move us along in our strategic plan, the roadmap. So if we want to get all 50 states to have Medicaid expansion passed, we're going to use a variety of different individual tactics to achieve that strategic goal. Maybe we're going to collect petition signatures. Maybe in one state we can get a ballot initiative put on the ballot in an election where the voters vote directly on Medicaid expansion. So that's a tactic. Maybe one tactic is civil disobedience. Maybe one tactic is running for office. So these individual tactics add up to a campaign to achieve a strategic goal. In this case, it would be getting the Medicaid expansion passed in the 50 states. And that strategic goal is contributing to our overall roadmap for getting where we want to go. I'll pause. And welcome back, Keisha.
I tend to have questions like this. How are you creating a strategy without creating pit stops first?
Well, because if you don't know if you're going to be taking buses, trains, if you're going to be driving along your route to get there, if you don't know your overall big picture approach to it, then how do you know where you're going to stop along the way or how you're going to stop? Because if you're going to take buses, then your pit stop options might look totally different than if you're driving yourself. Right? And so in the case of Medicaid expansion, we need to know, or universal health care, we need to know, okay, well, are we going to get universal health care? That one's pretty, we're going to use a different example today, which I think is going to be the no more burning trash example. But universal health care, we have a couple of different options of achieving that, right, in the big picture. And if we don't know what our big picture approach is going to be, then, so let's say our vision is we don't want anyone living in poverty anymore. So if we don't want anyone living in poverty anymore, we know that folks have to make a certain amount of money to not be classified as being in poverty. So our strategic approach overall, we could say, oh, well, we're going to achieve this by achieving a universal basic income for everyone. Or we can say we're going to achieve this by increasing the minimum wage for everyone. So if we don't know what approach we're going to take to bring that vision to life, then we can't set goals for how to move that approach forward.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, I was being thrown off by something on my end.
Okay. Um, well, I think that's a really great question, Hanaya. So thank you so much for asking it. Any other thoughts or questions from Hanaya or Sharon or Keisha?
I guess. Is there going to be a list of strategies that you're suggesting, or strategy categories? Is that just the four R's question right there?
So the strategies, there's not really categories for strategies because I think it really does depend on the vision as to like different strategic approaches. But the four R's are meant to help think of different, like they are meant to provide different kinds of containers that you might want to include in your strategic approach. Um, so if we were thinking about the four R's and forming a strategic approach through that, and we're thinking about the like no one's living in poverty end goal, then we might want a strategic plan that is resisting the current. So that's the first R, right? Resisting the current status quo of like valuing human life based on contributions. So maybe one strategic approach is like dismantling wage labor or something. And then maybe we also want to reform the current structure that allows, or no, let me actually go back. So maybe we want to resist the way that inequality is driven, like the wealth gap is driven by stocks that CEOs get paid with. Okay, so maybe we're gonna like resist that by like removing the option to pay CEOs with stocks and like driving up their wealth that way. Then we want to reform the current way that wage labor works. So maybe we want to pass a federal minimum that's tied to inflation, and that's like our version of reform. Then maybe we want to reimagine new ways of existing outside of wage labor, and so we recreate alternative means of exchanging labor, time, and energy within our own communities as part of this overall strategic approach. So 100% the four R's are meant to provide like containers that we can think of as we shape this big strategic approach. But there's not a specific like list of categories. Maybe it's helpful if we lean into the burning trash example and think about like if we use, so someone on our, as we were visioning, can't remember which person it was, but someone said they just don't want people to be burning trash anymore, like especially in their community. Apparently it's a big problem, and so that's part of their big vision. It's a very specific example. And so maybe the end goal in our example for the purpose of our time together is we want there to be no more burning trash in the state of West Virginia. And one of our sort of intermediate strategic goals is for there to be no more burning trash in the Whoville community of West Virginia. So the big picture outcome is no more burning trash in the Whoville community. Oh, perfect. There you are. All my neighbors still do it. Okay, exactly. So Sharon lives in Whoville, West Virginia, in theory. Our big long-term strategic goal is no more trash burning at the, we'll say the, this is the big picture goal. One of our strategic goals is to get no more trash burning in Whoville. And as we strategize around this outcome, we want to make sure that we are planning for aspects of this campaign that will improve material conditions of lives. So when I say this, it's like We don't necessarily want to just penalize people who burn trash, because that's actually not improving their material conditions, right? And then it might actually be making things worse, because then we have crime going up. When people are criminalized, poverty increases, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to be mindful about this, improving material conditions of lives. And it can involve additional outcomes. So, what are the outcomes related to skills and tools and knowledge that can be built, shared, and exercised by individuals and the collective in relationship to this end goal as we're strategizing around it? So, maybe it's something like community members have knowledge about how to sustainably reuse, recycle, or dispose of their trash, like composting, for example. Maybe it's outcomes. Maybe the community members have the tools to create shared composting and waste management processes. And the third thing that we can think about are outcomes related to the power dynamic within the community that might be relevant to the end goal. So, going back to what I was saying about, like, we wouldn't necessarily just want to criminalize folks who are burning trash, because another reason we wouldn't want to do that is because that would be bringing the goal to life via an existing form of centralized power and just reaffirming the hierarchy. So, if the county commission passes a law that just fines people who burns their trash, that's still exercising power over. It's still most harmful to poor people and folks who are vulnerable. It's not actually improving their material conditions. It might be causing them to struggle more. And it's also still weaponizing punishment as a means of maintaining that power over. And so it's not forming a power with when we address the issue in that way. So maybe it would be something like creating a community care coalition that like works in partnerships with different neighborhoods to address their own needs in regards to waste practices, recycling, composting, etc. And then thinking also about outcomes related to decentralizing leadership and decision making. So in the example of shaping a strategy that addresses the trash burning, and a campaign strategy that addresses the trash burning in Whoville, we would want to maybe consider solutions that are informed by community input and consensus. And that's an example of decentralizing the decision making in the process, right? The county commission isn't just coming in and saying, this is what we're going to do, but we're working with the community to generate buy-in, to get consensus, and to build out potential shared solutions. Hi, Leslie.
Is it a good time to talk?
Go for it.
So, based on what I'm hearing, I think the pyramid you had before of vision, strategy, campaigning for strategies, individual tactics, I would add another layer between vision and strategy, specifically of uh, um, strategic values, and there you do have some set reminders of the the community building outcome checklist that you're telling us right now, the 4 R's, and any other philosophy that you learn along the way.
I think that's a great conceptualization of that. Hi, Leslie. Um, Maybe it's helpful. I'm going to recap real quick what we've covered so far, which is not much, but also I think it's just helpful for all of us to kind of like hear it reaffirmed, since you are just entering the space. So we building off of like what we learned last week about these frameworks for strategic planning, and these frameworks for viewing how we can organize that isn't just like end things that are problems, but that are much more robust than that, and introducing the strategy chart. this week I wanted to kick us off by just giving us more clarity around the definition of strategy and thinking about strategizing as a verb as opposed to building a strategy that is a noun. And so the act of strategizing is like a constant ongoing thing, kind of like balance, right? Balance is a verb and not a noun. And it's all about turning what you have, your resources, which are constantly shifting, right? Based on like relationships, who you have access to, funding, et cetera, turning those resources into the power that we need, which is shared power, power with, to get what we want, which is the change that we want to see in the world. And last week, we really clarified, like, what do we want? That was this big visioning that we did, where we talked about all of these miracle like imaginary scenarios that is like this is the world that we want to live in. And so where you were entering, Leslie, is we had just talked about how when we are planning a movement or when we're participating in a movement, we're really planning on multiple layers. So we have this big vision of where we want to be. So if this were a road trip, we would know our end destination. Like we want to end up in California. We know we're starting in North Carolina. And then the strategy, the overall strategy, is this overall map that we use to get there. And so if our vision is of a world where no one lives in poverty, there's a lot of different routes that we can take to bring that vision to life, just like there's a lot of different routes that we can take to get from North Carolina to California. And the route that we take and the way that we get there might depend it will definitely depend on the resources that are available to us. So if I don't have a car, my route is going to depend on train routes and bus routes, right? If I do have a car, even still, I'm going to decide, am I just going to hop on 40 and drive all the way through, or am I going to take the north route, the southern route, etc.? And that's our strategy. That's the map that we use to get there. And then when we were talking about those long-term goals, the intermediate goals, and the short-term goals last week as we introduced that strategy chart, these are the intentional pit stops along our route. And these pit stops depend on our overall approach, right? Because if I'm going to California on a bus, my options for pit stops are going to look dramatically different than if I'm going to California in my own car. And so the goals are going to be different. Maybe I want to see this really cool tourist attraction in Tennessee, but if I'm going via bus, then I'm going to have to think about individual tactics, which are the individual actions that will get me to see that really cool tourist attraction that I want to see. I'm going to have to get off the bus, maybe find a lift, etc., which is a totally different situation than if I'm staying in my car. And so these individual tactics are the necessary steps that might look like collecting petition signatures would be one tactic. Running for office might be another tactic. Holding regular potlucks that are also trainings might be another tactic. And understanding this pyramid, then we were thinking about this through the lens of the one specific goal that Sharon brought up in her, or not specific goal, but part of Sharon's vision from last week was the no more burning trash. And I just felt like this was a very clear example for us to work towards. So we were then thinking about this through the lens of that vision of no more burning trash. And I was using hypothetical Whoville in West Virginia as the place where we wanted to start for this no more burning trash. And thinking about going back to the principles of organizing when we're planning, when we are planning our outcomes that we want to work towards, the pit stops along the way, thinking about, are the outcomes kind of meeting this checklist based on those organizing principles? So we could easily say we're going to make it to where there's no more burning trash through a strategic approach where we have our county commission just pass a law that punishes people with a fine if they burn trash. But that's not actually changing the power dynamic. That's still using power over to punish people who are likely already poor, so it's only making them suffer more if they're having to pay a fine for something. It's not building their skills or their tools or their knowledge related to sustainable waste management practices. And so thinking about using the principles of organizing to shape a strategic approach that is building power, that is changing access to knowledge, skills, tool, and that in the process is also decentralizing decision making through things like community consensus, getting community buy-in, etc. Okay, just now seeing Sharon's comment. I am in a recycling cooperative that got recycling on the ballot and forced our county to start our first recycling center about 6 years ago. Since then, the county commission has started their own recycling commission, which has led to many cooperative members feeling powerless and alienated. They feel they have no power after feeling so empowered with our progress the first few years. It's hard to get many involved in any way now. Many of us have already had bad relationships with the local government. It's an example of the current system taking our power after we set the groundwork. Yes, which is why strategic planning is so important, because then we're planning for this potential thing. And we also know that the community cooperative is only a pit stop on a larger trip, right? So when the powers that be ultimately come in and try to swoop in, it's like we already kind of know what our next pit stop is going to be anyway. So we're like, okay, take this so we can move on and do the next big thing that moves us towards ending trash burning for good. Of course, Keisha. I'll pause again. Leslie, how are you? And do you have any questions for us about what I just ran through?
Hi, thank you for the recap. I'm doing all right. A little like overwhelmed feeling, because I guess I feel like there's so many pit stops that need to happen. Um, but yeah, I just yeah, got my toddler. Um, and questions at the moment, no. I'm just here to listen. But thank you. I appreciate everyone.
Of course. And there are a lot of pit stops. That's so true. If we think the example that I have seen used is like uh, the example of ending racism as as like the big picture vision, right? And if we think about the Montgomery bus boycotts being the strategic goal was, so the big strategy was like, oh, we're going to end desegregation. And that's going to be one of our strategic approaches to achieving this vision for ending racism. We're going to end desegregation was the thought behind the Montgomery bus boycott, right? One of the strategic goals towards ending segregation, or sorry, I was saying end desegregation. We're going to implement desegregation, end segregation, excuse me. One of the strategic goals is to desegregate the buses. And one of the tactics that they used to desegregate the buses was the bus boycotts, right? And so there's so many pit stops, and that's so true, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep trying to make it to the next pit stop, because each one is getting us closer and closer and closer and closer. At this point, racism is by no means eradicated. However, we have had our first black president, right? And we are now working towards, part of the conversation about ending racism is straight up abolishing the police industrial system, which is a huge conversation to be had when we think about the fact that we're there when we were at just like, can we desegregate the buses so we can sit next to each other, right? So like we are a long ways from where we were when the Montgomery bus boycotts were happening, even though we're absolutely not at the top of the mountain by any means.
Um, and I think what is just Gail was saying though, right? It's kind of how I feel about certain things. I don't know if anyone else can relate. Like they fought so hard, right, for voting rights. And then it feels like, well, but here now comes um the power saying, "Oh, you know what? We're just gonna like take that away again. We're just gonna now make all these challenges." And it's kind of like um they take that power back. And so it feels like spinning wheels. I feel in like so many different areas where it's just kind of like, oh, well, now we're gonna like give you all these other destinations. Yes. Right. So I feel like, or I think that how we strategize, or part of it is how do we not only like obtain these goals, but how do we keep it in our power and not hand it over to where it has those feelings of powerlessness.
I think that's a really great point. And I wanted to bring us back to the emergent strategy principles because one of the principles, actually, kind of two of them speak to this. One is the principle of resiliency or the element of resiliency, right? Like our strategic planning needs to think about the fact that we can't control if the powers and that be decide to swoop in and take things over all the time, right? Like there may be situations where we absolutely can prevent that from happening by planning ahead, but really what we need to be planning for is the idea that that's going to happen, and how do we plan for resiliency so that even when we experience losses and we experience challenges and we experience setbacks, because it's all iterative, right? It's all non-linear and iterative. It's not just going to be straight progress. How do we build in resiliency so that our folks can go, dang, this is so frustrating and we worked so hard. We know what we're going to do next and we have each other to lean on. And how do we adapt when we're confronted with things that we weren't expecting to happen? And forming a strategic plan that is prepared for challenges, that is prepared for setbacks, that is prepared for hardships, I think is a lot more important than trying to prevent the losses from happening in the first place. Or is a lot more, I would say, within our control, not necessarily important. Okay. So when we think about the idea of reaching this hypothetical goal of ending trash burning in this Whoville, West Virginia community, as an example, let's stop for a second and just think, because Sharon already has an example of folks who are clearly against them based on her experience. But let's think about all of the individuals that we can possibly think of, all of the groups who are going to be impacted in some way by our work around this, towards this outcome, and where they might lie on our spectrum of support. So let's just do a little group brainstorm together. And we can, exactly, when we build community, it's always good. So who are some of the people that we think are definitely going to be down for the cause of ending trash burning in Whoville, West Virginia? Who's going to be like, I'm in, I want to support, I'm down? Maybe this recycling group that you've already mentioned, Sharon? I heard somebody come off mute, I think.
Yeah, I was gonna say, hey, start speaking, but I didn't want to interrupt Sharon. Sharon's just gal who's is typing that right now, right?
Yeah, and usually I think typing tends to work better for Sharon, so.
Um, Anyone who is specifically against smog or air pollution, I would have just said environmentalists, but there could be a possibility of some environmentalists having a uncertain outlook on what role burning trash plays. So environmentalists in general could be passively a step below.
Cool.
Maybe I'm assuming what passively support means.
Nope, that's perfect. And maybe people with like asthma or something also in that category.
Yeah, I was just gonna say people with asthma, and I lived in a neighborhood where a woman walked all the time. Like did a lot of outdoor activities, and the smoke just prevented her from being able to enjoy being outdoors. So there could be outdoor enthusiasts, depending on where it is, that would want to decrease in that.
Absolutely. Are there other groups who might either definitely be down, or folks who are like probably going to want to support based on these interests like this, but who either like might not be super enthusiastic or might not know enough or might not be public in their support? Okay. As we think about that, are there folks who are going to be on the other end who might be very against us on this issue, who have something to lose by us putting an end to the trash burning in West Virginia, in Whoville, West Virginia?
Just right quick,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't like the business owners or like the city that takes trash and recycling, wouldn't they like passively support because they want your trash? Would that
So maybe they're like somewhere in between passive support and neutral almost.
probably?
I'm I'm actually I'm actually having trouble imagining someone being against this, but obviously it's a current issue that people are still struggling with, so clearly someone is against it in some way.
So Sharon says people who are afraid of change, who are holding on to traditions. People who are afraid of change, holding on to traditions. Maybe it's people who are outside of the trash management services reach. So they don't have access to their trash being picked up by the city, and therefore the burning is much more convenient for them. Cost is a real factor here, too. Yep. People with limited transportation in the rural outskirts. I see some typing. Are there other folks from your experience, Sharon, who were either engaged in this and supportive, or who were against y'all as you were, even in your experience in forming the recycling cooperative? And who were the kinds of people, I'm curious, who joined the recycling cooperative? And who are the kinds of people who are burning their trash right now? And why are they doing that? Because that gives us an idea of like why they might be against it. Folks on the right and the left. Did the people who joined the recycling cooperative, like, did they tend to fit into a certain demographic, professional background, or was there a particular reason that they were joining? Oldest county commissioner was totally against. Swears they will spend no county money on it. Okay. So, we know at least one county commissioner. Oldest county commissioner. No county money for this. So we've got city government, and then we've got county government, which it sounds like is like on the fence / against. We have no cities. Is there waste management at all there? Monopoly with a contract on the county, price goes up every year. Okay, so the corporation. Hey, Naya, what you got?
Would it be rude of me to say conspiracy theorists could be actively against the type of people who think that environmentalism is some global plot to kill people, which is apparently a thing that people think?
So climate deniers. And then are there folks who, like, we don't know where they are? Or folks who might be neutral on this issue, but who could be shifted in one direction or the other, like, depending on our approach.
Uninformed property owners?
Love that. Oops, I just deleted that.
I don't know if property owner is excessively specific, but
Folks who are too apathetic or too busy, stressed to think about it. So people who are just, like, unaware. Which is likely probably to be, like, family, working, aged folks, right? Like, folks who have a lot going on. There's people that just don't care.
There is the argument that trash and recycling trucks cause just as much damage by their emissions than burning. I mean, it's a real argument. I'm sure you've all heard it.
Okay. About 50% of homes that are vacation homes for out-of-state people, they don't do anything local. They're going to care if their property value goes down, which we're going to talk about self-interest here in a second. Okay, so vacation home owners, seasonal residents. Anyone else we want to add to this list? And this is unfinished, just like everything. We're constantly strategizing. So maybe we're like, oh, there's this whole other group of people we never even thought about. Okay, beautiful. So now that we have, like, we've talked about the mountain that takes us to our overall vision, and we have some idea of, like, the landscape that we're working with as far as the people go here. Now, let us visualize that same mountain structure as the roadmap to bringing our long-term vision to life, one outcome at a time. So if our big vision goal is no more trash burning, period, point blank. And let's say our intermediate goal is no more trash burning in Whoville, West Virginia. What are some of the short-term goals, the pit stops along the way, that can get us closer to this intermediate goal of no more trash burning in Whoville, West Virginia? Let's think about, like, if it's going to take us, let's say no more trash burning is our 3-year goal. What are some of the things that we want to see in a year that might help us get to this 3-year goal? And again, if we think about this, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, you first.
I was just gonna say, if we think about like no more trash burning, the big vision, again, back with the end racism big vision goal, the intermediate goal was to end segregation. Ours is to end trash burning in Whoville, West Virginia. And one of their short-term goals was to desegregate the buses. So what could one of our short-term goals be?
Could it be to identify, people that regularly burn trash? Right, and have those like communications and see who stops or decreases. So what would you call that? Like a survey, if you will, of who like just agrees to stop burning trash altogether, or maybe decreases.
So maybe what I'm hearing is kind of like one thing could be, so I'm hearing one, like almost like a tactic around like a survey, because the survey would be like one of the things that we do, it sounds like, to get individuals to opt out of burning the trash on their own. So maybe one of the short-term goals is a certain number of individuals, let's say like number of individuals voluntarily stop burning trash. And then we would identify tactics that are going to make that happen. So the tactics might be, I'm going to share. So we already have one tactic from Sharon, which is they set up booths at local events to provide bins for local businesses, for recycling. So in order to get individuals to stop burning trash voluntarily, there's like, we can do educational tactics, but we could also do skills building tactics, right? Where it's like, oh, maybe they actually need to learn how to compost, because what if they're burning paper plates? And it's like, hey, buddy, you can compost that actually, like use it for something else. And then if they learn to compost, maybe what we need to be passing out are actually the compost bins instead of recycling bins. So then there's a bunch of different tactics that we could put towards that one individual goal.
I was waiting to say create a viable recycling center.
Yep.
Or establish.
That's a great one. So, formal, viable recycling center established. And then tactics that might need to go into place for that would be forming this co-op that they already have formed, right? Maybe it's getting a certain number of petition signatures to support that recycling, getting people to vote to approve the recycling that Sharon mentioned. All of those are tactics that bring that recycling center to life. So the blues tactics, by the way, blue sticky notes. We gotta make it smaller. Boop, boop. Boop.
Um, I this might have already been said, but I imagine another goal would have to be um, figuring out how to link people to the recycling, specifically because of all the different ways people are ensuring accessibility, ensuring accessibility to the recycling.
Mm-hmm. So survey tactic also should ask, why are people burning their trash? What would make recycling more accessible? Identify who is burning trash. Measure progress. Maybe we host trainings or like workshops on sustainable waste management practices. As one of the tactics to get individuals to voluntarily stop. Maybe one of our goals is to have maybe one of our short-term goals is like one identifiable neighborhood, one or more, maybe it's like 5, it depends, it's up to the group that's organizing it, but be completely burn free. And so that gives us like, if we're gonna be, maybe that's the one that makes the most sense because it's like the smallest scale, and maybe our tactics for that look like forming a neighborhood think tank group to identify and gather consensus from neighborhood residents on solutions for their trash burning. Maybe one of the tactics is a community shared care team that maybe they identify that their neighborhood, the issue is transportation, getting to the waste management centers. And so maybe they form a shared care team that rotates shifts to take waste off to the management centers for folks. Maybe it's the formation of, maybe one of our goals is to form a reduce and reuse group that collects materials that can be upcycled, used by artists, etc., that don't even need to go into recycling or waste management. Does anyone have any other thoughts on potential short-term goals that would help to build skills, knowledge, or tools, or that would change the power dynamic in the community?
Does like the plastic bag ban, does that fall into too much of like they're just creating another rule like of power.
If we were going to put in a plastic bag ban, we would want to think about how we aren't just punishing people who depend on plastic bags, right? So if we're going to do something like that, how do we also maybe figure out how to provide like recycled cloth bags for folks?
Right.
That's kind of what I try to think about, is so that way, because if they're going to do a ban, like who's going to be facing the consequences for that and who's going to be the most vulnerable?
Right. I mean, and it takes, I mean, ultimately too, in some ways, although this might be sidestepping, right? It takes responsibility off of the companies that like don't package properly. They're the ones that should do a better job packaging and having like um compostable um
Mm.
packaging. So I don't, is that a tactic or
I would say a
Or that,
short-term goal might be to like have a piece of like county policy passed that incentivizes companies to use like sustainable packaging, um, to use or
or
sell items.
yeah, and part of the education could also be asking people to look for that type of packaging, which is hard. It's hard to find, and usually it's at like co-ops and or it's like in the organic, it's not, you know, um, it's clearly different when I go grocery, the type of packaging than if I do go to the co-op, right? And it's the price difference is extreme. So, um, could there be, I don't know, part of initiative just to like writing companies too, or is that too big?
Um,
Um,
I could see like if one of our goals was to get companies within the county to use and sell items with sustainable packaging, that there might be multiple tactics for that. So one of the tactics might be writing to the companies or the local managers or something like that. One of the tactics might be leveraging the county government to offer tax breaks when they do use sustainable packaging. One of the tactics might be like buying out newspaper ads that says like this company is good for our local environment and this company isn't, that like does some like public shaming tactic, which is also kind of educational, right? So I would say, yeah, writing the companies or someone involved in the companies could definitely be a tactic to move us towards like a goal related to getting the companies to do their part. Seeing the time, we have a big display with buy this, not that, with a lot of info, email list, they're online, great. So lots of like public education tactics happening. Um, so seeing the time, do we need to take a break? Do we need 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Y'all tell me what's best for your brain since we're a little over halfway. 10 minutes. Okay, so Sharon says 10 minutes. Let's meet back here at 6:50. Thanks for the alarm. I was hoping to get on here by 6:49, but didn't make it. No, it wasn't annoying at all. Always helpful to have a vocal cue. Oh, you have a whole YouTube channel? Yeah, definitely share it.
Wait, what? I mean, okay, I technically have a YouTube channel that is not really much on it. I have more of a TikTok channel, but where did you find this out in the first place?
I'll give folks a. I know you mentioned something about your channel. I don't know if you had clarified it was TikTok or YouTube in a previous session.
Well, now I feel like I'm gonna get myself in trouble with our teacher here because I thought our teacher might have already known who I was on TikTok.
Oh, I know who you are on TikTok.
Okay.
Yeah. No. But I know you had mentioned your channel, but I don't know for. It was Sharon who asked if you would share your YouTube channel, and I don't know if you had mentioned when you mentioned your channel previously if it was TikTok or YouTube.
Yeah, I'm a redheaded activist. I'm the one who originally made the comment that got uh, that got Chelsea thinking about this. I think.
Yes, you were actually. You were like, do you have any educational stuff, or would you be willing to teach about this or meet about this or something? Is your YouTube the same as your TikTok handle?
Um, I don't remember. Let me look it up.
Just so I'm not passing along some random person's handle and then or following some random person. Okay, so now that we're back, and now that we have some great little short-term goals and pit stops that we plan to make along the way to our final destination, our big strategic vision, and we have this general idea of our current landscape and like who supports us, who doesn't, the folks somewhere in between. Now we can start to think about a little bit of order of operations. What makes sense to go after first based on our resources and based on the pillars that are currently holding up the status quo of conditions. So we're going to talk about the pillars of support here in a second. But when it comes to building power with others and planning a strategy that is dedicated to building power with the folks across our spectrum of support, we're going to want to strategize around shifting the stance of the vast majority of folks in that spectrum, whether they're against us or whether they're with us right now, knowing that we're not going to be able to shift all of them at once. So this is where we're going to want to give careful thought to the order of operations for our strategic planning when it comes to pulling the folks on the spectrum further to the left to supporting us, further on board with our cause. Some of the folks are going to have more power over direct power over some of our concerns and the solutions that we want to see. But just because they have more power over doesn't mean that they are always the most accessible. And just because we want to make it to California during our road trip, we can't just teleport there. We can't skip past all of the states in between. We have to have some kind of order of operations. So it can be helpful for us to create an order of operations for ourselves that starts with the folks who are most accessible and leads us towards the folks who have the most power over right now. So for the purpose of thinking about who is the most accessible and the layers of involvement when it comes to who is involved in different institutions and who's upholding the status quo, it can be helpful to imagine the status quo as a roof that's being upheld by these different pillars of support. And each pillar is like essentially a different group or a different institution or a different organization that's made up of multiple people with different levels of influence and authority within those groups. So, for example, if we think about our trash burning situation, the current status quo of folks are burning trash is being upheld by lots of different folks across the board. Maybe it's being upheld by the state government because the state government doesn't fund sustainable waste programs. Maybe it's being upheld by the local government because that one old county commissioner says we're not going to spend any money on this. Maybe it's being upheld by the media because the media isn't doing their job to inform folks about what is happening, what their options are, what different solutions are. Maybe it's being upheld by nonprofits who are enabling the trash burning. Maybe it's being upheld by corporations and businesses who are participating in the trash burning. Maybe it's being upheld by particular neighborhoods in which folks just don't know each other and aren't helping each other to get their trash taken care of properly. Maybe it's being upheld by schools that aren't teaching children prior to adulthood about safe and sustainable waste management practices. And within each of those groups of people or institutions, if you cut that pillar in half, you'll see that the pillar itself is made up of layers of material, this concentric circle structure. And those layers are different for each pillar, but it's always similar in that there's multiple layers. And so if we take, for example, the idea of the local government, we may have our elected county officials who are the final decision makers on the trash and recycling policy, the funding that goes into those programs. And for that reason, they are at the very center of the pillar because they are the core power holders in this hierarchical power over. The layer outside of them might be, maybe there's like boards and committees that are committed to taking on specific local issues, such as trash or such as transportation, which could increase accessibility, such as education, which could teach about sustainability. The just outside of that layer may be like department administrators, such as the waste management department or such as the education department. And then outside of that layer, we may have service managers who coordinate those services. So maybe this is the person who hires who signs the contract for that corporation that handles waste management currently, instead of having a whole waste management department. And then outside of that layer, we may have the actual workers themselves who are doing the waste services work, or maybe it's the people who are burning the trash themselves. When we think about these pillars, when we are thinking about pulling these pillars out from under the status quo, out from under that roof, it's important that we think about it as pulling rather than pushing, because if we push on these layers and we push and push and push, it's likely to actually add pressure to that central core and increase the density, right? It's not actually helping us to weaken the pillar. But if we think about pulling at the pillar layer by layer, starting with the layers on the outside, then we can actually weaken the pillar bit by bit and pull it straight out from under the status quo. And strategically targeting pillars by recognizing which pillars might be able to influence other pillars. So for example, maybe we have the media, which can influence our local government by creating a narrative or participating in like public shaming or public education campaigns, et cetera, et cetera. Or maybe there's one neighborhood that has a lot of sway for some reason because the people there maybe who have a lot of money or something like that. Or it's the folks who are second homeowners who can influence the local government because they are the primary taxpayers or something like that because of their property taxes. So sometimes you'll need to strategically bypass pillars because they just aren't accessible, or willing to work with us, and we need other pillars to knock them over a little bit. So maybe the local government isn't accessible to us right now because of this old county commissioner guy, but maybe there are specific neighborhoods that are accessible to us because we already know some of the people in those neighborhoods who are upset about the trash burning and who are ready to get to work. And the way we pull these pillars from the outside is through relationships and building relationships, which is why we prioritized those skills for trauma informed organizing that are necessary for having transformative conversations with other folks so that we can build relationships with them before we ever even started talking about strategy. Because it's all going to come down to building relationships with folks across that entire spectrum. And just doing so in a strategic order of operations. So when you sit down to form your actual strategic campaign plan, normally this isn't all happening at once. That's why we haven't done all of this at once. And that's why the strategic planning training sessions are across 4 different sessions. But when you sit down to form your strategic campaign plan, it can be helpful to sit down and list those pillars that you see as the primary pillars that are upholding the status quo in the situation, and then to rank them based on their importance and their accessibility, while also thinking about possible inroads to those pillars. Like, where can we start at for the pooling? And as you fill out this chart, it can also be helpful to sit down and do a mind map for the pillars one at a time, which can help with the ranking because you can always move them, back and forth. A mind map is essentially just putting the pillar, bye Keisha, putting the pillar in the center and then brainstorming various inroads that might be used to affect where the pillar stands. So these ideas, these inroads, can range from as simple as listing influential individuals that we want to talk to, or to imagining whole concrete tactical approaches related to this pillar. So why don't we think about the key, looking at our spectrum, thinking about this in particular, what does it feel like are some of the key pillars that are upholding the status quo in this situation? We've got county commission, county government. I would call it county government, and then on the outside, because it's the whole pillar is the county government, and the county commission is like one of the pieces of that inside the pillar. And there's other things that go into county government too, right? Like the voters themselves, probably like county manager, who might not even be an elected position necessarily, is probably appointed by the county commission. Hanaya, I saw you had come off mute for a second. Was there something you wanted to add?
No, it was. I was gonna say county commission. Maybe say something about the climate deniers, but that's just like voters. I don't know.
So maybe the climate deniers, maybe that falls into a larger pillar. Maybe that's one of the rings in the larger pillar that is kind of like the residents. Oops. Because then within the residents, we've kind of got this. So let me see if I can copy one of my circles here. Let's make a copy of this friend and put them right here. I'm going to change the outside.
You didn't,
Go ahead. Sorry.
no, I thought you were grabbing more than, and you're fine. You're fine.
So maybe we've got like this is the pillar of residence, and maybe we've got climate deniers is one of the rings, which is probably not going to be very easy to change. So we might want to put that like somewhere in the middle. Maybe we've got the parents would fall into this, right? Like parents of children are one of the rings who also kind of influence some of the other things like the schools and education, and who are also voters, so they also kind of influence that, and they might be more accessible on the outside here. And then maybe we've got the folks with breathing struggles. And we've got the second, the seasonal residents. So then if we're going to, okay, so then let's also think, if we were going to rank, well, are there any missing? And then if not, if we were going to rank the pillars that we have on here right now. Before we even rank them, let's maybe think about like why are each of these important and are they accessible? So when we think about county government, let's make another copy of this and make it county government. So I'm going to say this is residents over here. And then this is county government over here. We've got in the very, very middle our elected officials. We've got our county manager probably in here, who's probably an appointed person, who's probably just outside that ring of elected officials. We've got our
I would actually think that appointed officials would be in the sort of a center thing, because you can't you don't even have the vote to affect them. You can only the only people who can affect them are the elected officials. So I guess you could show them to resign or something.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is that it's like one person that like you could have a one-on-one with and potentially move them depending on that one person, right? Whereas the elected officials, it's like there's a whole board that we're going to have to work with. So accessibility can look like different things, I think, in different contexts. But that you do raise a good point that like it actually might be a situation where the county manager is in the middle, because maybe they have direct control over the decision here. It sounds like the elected officials also might have had a little bit more control in the situation because of what Sharon was sharing about the folks voted some percent. So that also tells me there is a level of like the voters in the county government. But these very well could be like interchangeable or movable. They're dynamic, 100%.
And I don't know why this popped up, and but like when I think of like in Cherokee County and the mayor of Murphy, he also does like the radio. Uh and I feel like sometimes in these smaller towns or like units, like people have multiple roles. Um and so I mean, that is also an angle too. I just don't know how it fits into
Mm-hmm.
into this.
No, the way it fits is exact. So when we think about, as we're starting to think about like our order of operations, those are exactly the kinds of things that we're going to want to think about, right? Because it's all about relationships, whether it's relationships that we have with other people who we might can pull strings of, or whether we know relationships like what you just named. So if we add the media as a pillar, we might want to think like, oh, the mayor has no power over the decision in regards to waste management, but the mayor is the radio host, and the radio is a huge source of local information, which makes this much more accessible than more of the other pillars. And if we know that the media can influence these other pillars, that's that domino effect we're looking for, right? Where it's like not only like the media itself can't make the final decision, but it had like in this case it would be more accessible and it would help us to start knocking over some of these other pillars. And so 100%, those are the kinds of things that as we start to think about, like, why did we rank these things in the order that we did, and we moved them around as we dump these ideas in, those are exactly the things that we will want to think about.
Yeah, and that made me think of right, because I always think of education, school projects that like we had and how we got that information, like Save the Whales was huge and cutting like tabs on our soda, like the plastic. Um, and the League of Women Voters here in Hendersonville put this project out to all the middle schoolers if they did a project on the environment and like what are things that like the county could do to improve the environment. And there were like just different areas that kids could do a project on. When I think of how that was an outside group kind of infiltrating into the school system with like, here's a project, here's a prize. Because I really think it's about teaching the youth to care for the environment. I think when I'm 44, like when I grew up, just as a quick example, like there weren't trash cans. You just threw stuff out the window. You always saw people dumping their car ashtray out just right onto the ground. I mean, I think those things are unheard of now. Like I don't see it. Like, I mean, maybe every once in a while, but just to say that education in my mind plays like the biggest role. So, as a tactic, I don't mean to jump around here, but
Mm-mm.
um just as we infiltrate, if that's the right word, um schools and offering like projects to kids and there's a prize. But um it also got us to learn like, farmers care about the environment, and I feel like there's so many different educational angles, especially here where, there are, kids live on farms and work on farms and yeah. So again, I'm sorry. My brain actually is like has a hard time like getting into categories. So
That's why you totally can jump around on these things. I'm the same way. I do what I call is a brain dump, and it's like I'll typically be like going back and forth between things. Which normally, if we were in person, I'd be flip charting all of this, and it'd like all be on a wall, so we could flip chart all at once. But yeah, what you're naming is that like the media, in addition to being accessible and being able to push some of it offers tactical resources. So when we start to talk about tactics in our future settings, it offers resources for tactics that can shift the other pillars too. So it offers potentially the resource to make change in the schools and education based on what you were just describing. It offers resources for tactics related to putting public pressure on elected officials, maybe. It offers resources for tactics related to public education and changing the narrative around people who are climate deniers, or people like raising awareness of the issue for people who struggle with breathing challenges. And it's a reliable source of information for folks if it's this particular radio station. So what you're naming is that, like, maybe media, because then we're going to have to decide, where do we start with all of this, right? Like, we've got all of these options that we can approach. And so the whole point of figuring out the pillar to start with is, like, the whole reason we do this is to figure out our starting target. So when we get to when we go back, because we're bouncing around, when we go back to our strategic planning chart, this is when we're going to start thinking about targets, aka pillars. So our target might be the mayor radio station. And our tactics might be school projects, or our tactic might be like a public education campaign led, hosted by the mayor on the radio station to generate public buy-in and support for recycling, sustainable alternatives. So that's the whole reason we think about all of our pillars, etc., so that then we can actually start mapping out, all right, here's where we need to start. And if the media is going to be what we want to approach first, well, also, is there anything that we need to do to get the mayor on our side to buy into this in the first place? Are we going to have to put pressure on the mayor to get him to do what we want him to do, him or her? Or them?
Yeah, I mean, I know specifically this mayor, it's like you pay for your 15 minutes, right? So it's like, I think $5 for your interview, but in general, there's right the radio stations that maybe just charge like $10 for a 30-second spot, and they'll run your spot multiple times. Um, and education that way as well. But persuading, um, yeah, I guess my brain keeps going to, like, people want to know what's in it for them.
Exactly.
Yeah, what's in it
for self-interest. Exactly.
So it feels like a lot of different, like, target audiences.
And so one of the things that will go into deciding which target makes the most sense to start with for our order of operations is also going to be, on that note, Leslie, our organizational considerations and resources. So, like, what do we actually have the capacity to do with what we have right now, right? Like, where can we actually realistically start? Are there relationships that we already have? We know in this case, it's going to just cost us money to get on the radio station. What money do we have? If we don't have money, where can we get it? So we would start to think, this is what the whole organizational considerations and resources column of your strategy chart. So I'm going to update those columns and upload the chart, or relink the chart in the follow-up materials. But so we would want to think about, like, okay, so the folks who are definitely on our side, who, like, we don't even have to do any work for them because they're already here with us, they're strategic planning with us. What are their competencies, strengths, and skills that we're starting with, right? So maybe this is people with a lot of knowledge about recycling. Maybe they're, like, middle-class folks with some spending money. Maybe we have skills related to composting skills, group facilitation skills. One target is the people who do recycle already, getting them more involved. So maybe we know that there's, like, strengths that some folks with personal experience recycling so they can contribute a narrative about how easy it is. Maybe they can help teach others to recycle. And then what are the resources that we're bringing into the campaign? So this would be like, okay, well, how many people do we have on our side that are available to us right now who are willing to do the work? Maybe we are starting with a group of 5 people with like 100 people who are potential, who have potential to get involved based on their current recycling activity. Maybe we have folks committed to throw in $10 each, and we know that we're gonna have, that means we have $50 of spending for interviews, media coverage. Maybe we know that we have the recycling center. Maybe we also know that we have a local farm willing to take compost materials. And then relationships are also resources, right? So if we have a relationship with the mayor or with a different newspaper or a particular, maybe we have a relationship with someone who's on a fundraising list that's not even in our town, but it can get us money that we can spend on this. So relationships with media, elected officials, neighbors, farmers, etc. Our reputation is a resource. And then we think about the resources that we need that we don't currently have. So if our ideal target is going to be reaching all of these folks who do recycle already, and we're like, oh, well, the tactic that we're going to try to use to reach them is a mailer that we're going to mail out to all the folks, then we're going to need the materials we need materials for mailers, printing, addresses of those who currently utilize recycling. We need spaces to host our educational workshops, whatever it is to make your tactic come to life. And one of the things that we're likely to need that we don't have are going to be relationships. Relationships with the right people are really ultimately what it's going to come down to when pulling these pillars along, because relationships in this context are going to be based on self-interest. And relationships are built via one-on-one conversations. So the only way that we're going to learn that we can buy our way into the mayor is to have had a one-on-one conversation or learned this information through a relationship with either the mayor or someone who has a relationship to the mayor. And the reason I share this is because really this is what your organizing is going to come down to, is one-on-ones. Y'all having one-on-ones, other people having one-on-ones, y'all teaching folks how to have one-on-ones. And this is because one-on-one conversations are meant to establish connections with others anywhere across the spectrum of support, to understand their values, their self-interest, and their resources, and to form a relationship with them based on shared interests. And it's as easy as reaching out to someone that we want to have a one-on-one with, setting up time to have a conversation for 30 to 45 minutes, and then having the conversation. And during the conversation, that's the time to lean on the skills that we were learning about in sessions 4 and 5, related to that trauma-informed organizing, the deep canvassing, the motivational interviewing, the understanding self-interest, the articulating that self-interest, the practicing compassionate curiosity. All of those skills come out in the one-on-one to draw out their interest. And so we do our one-on-ones based on who we need to start building relationships with to start pulling more folks in. So maybe, based on what you just shared, Sharon, maybe you actually do need more bodies before you can even start targeting someone like the mayor. And so we need to start having one-on-ones with folks who are currently recycling. And in general, we're about to wrap up. I know we're coming up on time, but the last thing that I wanted to share with y'all is the roadmap to a one-on-one, which, because I know structure can be helpful, and so if you did want like a step-by-step guide to one-on-ones, in general, the flow of a successful one-on-one will look like starting with an introduction where like you share your story, why you're here, why you care, a little bit about your self-interest, why you're bringing people together to start with. You then move on to connecting with the other person. So this is trying to understand why they are here, what brings them to this conversation, and starting to draw out some of their story. And that takes you seamlessly into step 3, which is all about listening, engaging in compassionate curiosity, and listening for their values, hopes, motivations, that self-interest piece. The 4th step will usually be visioning together. So asking them, like, what are the solutions that they want to see? Starting to co-identify solutions that we can work towards together that meets both our needs and interests based on what you learn from them. And then, if it makes sense, asking them to step into the work, to level up their engagement. Is there a commitment, a next step that makes sense for them? Can we ask them to get involved on some level? And then wrapping up with some kind of follow-up. So establishing when y'all are going to talk next, or what the next steps are, how you're going to get in touch with each other, that kind of thing. And so if this is, 30 minutes, it's not like you're spending, if you're in a meeting for 30 minutes with someone, you're not going to have to do an hour-long self-story, right? You're going to share a couple of minutes worth of like why you're doing this work, etc. Spend most of your time asking them questions and listening. I like to use like a 70-30 kind of ratio, 70% listening and 30% talking during the entirety of the one-on-one. And then, towards the very end, you're going to start touching on like, well, what would you think about this solution? How would you feel about working on this together? Asking them to take a step into the work, and then establishing like, I'm so excited you're going to come to our interest meeting, or you're going to come to our community solutions town hall. Is it okay if I give you a text the day before to remind you that it's happening? And that would be establishing that follow-up. Seeing that we've only got a couple of minutes left, I'll stop yammering and pause for final thoughts and questions on building relationships based on strategically looking at an order of operations for who to approach to make the change that you need to get to the first steps of your strategic planning.
Would it be too ridiculous for you to ask for a summary of the order of operations?
Well, so the order of operations depends on the pillars that, and the kind of analysis that you're doing of the pillars, right? So based on your people and the issues, the sort of short-term goals that y'all decide on. So in this case, our short-term goals being individuals stop burning trash. There's a formal recycling center established. Companies in the county stop using or start using sustainable packaging. We would look at all of the pillars that are upholding the current status quo of whatever the problem is. If the problem is burning trash, or if the problem is lack of health care, whatever it is. The pillars that are upholding that, looking at each of those pillars and who makes up those pillars. So in the case of what we talked about, we gave examples of the county government being made up of different layers of elected officials, appointed officials, voters, the pillar of the residents in this situation being made up of layers of climate deniers, seasonal residents, parents of children, folks with breathing struggles and challenges, and then thinking through each of those pillars about the different possible inroads to those pillars and the different resources that are available through those pillars, so that we start to paint a picture of like which pillar is the most accessible to us, as well as potentially impacts other pillars. So we talked through the idea of, in this case, we might want to start with the media because it's the most accessible, and because we know that it can offer resources that would then allow us to tactically approach the schools, the residents, even the elected officials and the county government. And based on, then as we think about our organizational considerations, we can start to think about, like, okay, well, what are the resources that we actually have to work with, so that we know which pillar we can actually target to start with. And once we have an idea of which pillar we're going to start with based on our campaign, then we can start to think about, okay, I need to start having one-on-ones from this starting place. So I need to start having one-on-ones with, if we decided the county government was the way to go, it might be having one-on-ones with voters, and maybe we start with the voters who are currently recycling. So the order of operations is going to depend on the pillars and the resources that you have available to you, and the spectrum of supporters. That was my attempt at a summary.
I will make more sense of it at another time. It unfortunate at night for me.
I
It's not
totally
your fault.
understand. I'm probably not giving a great summary either, because my brain is also a little bit fried. Leslie, any thoughts or questions? Or Hanaya, go ahead.
No, I was about to say the same thing.
Great minds think alike.
Are you trying to talk, Leslie? You're muted.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it helps fit it helps just break down like the big pictures and direct it into why you'd be contacting like specific people.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so it takes some of the, you know, it just helps break down so that I think it's clear in your mind, in my mind, um like the different avenues and different people to reach out to and why. I think it puts more thought into the specifics of um who you want to connect and why, and who you need to connect with,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like what's yeah. And from some of my own experience, sometimes I feel just like when you have one-on-ones and share, sometimes the people that you're talking to then have other ideas of they already have people in their circle and they're like, oh, I can connect with this person might also be
Exactly.
interested in this, and yeah.
Yes, exactly. And that's why, also going back to the idea that strategy is a verb, not a noun, right? So we come up with this we do all of this thought, come up with all of these ideas, we put it in this strategy chart, but then we meet with someone who has way more information and insight than us, and has a ton of networks and people that they connect with, and maybe a bunch of influence, and suddenly we change our whole plan because now we have way more resources to work with, so we could start somewhere that we couldn't previously start with. We have way more information and insight that helps us better hone in which steps are actually going to be optimal for moving us towards that bigger vision. So this is why we're constantly changing and adapting and being flexible.
Yeah, and then I feel also like then there's also people that are like, oh yeah, so and so tried to do the same thing X amount of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Try to contact them to see what they did or see where they're at and their process. So sometimes I feel also like we've thought of this like great idea and it's been done before or it's been attempted. Not to be discouraging, but like because there's usually new things in play.
Exactly.
Or there can already, yeah, be oh, they did this over in that town, so for that person. So sometimes like certain initiatives have already been like people are working on it or maybe something similar. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the one-on-ones. But this is good and helping the breakdown and like the specifics of people. Um yeah. And it's also good for, hey, I am looking for someone that maybe is over know anyone
Mm-hmm.
too. Like
Yep. And this is why you'll see like organizers always have a million flip charts because there's so much to it, but it is so much easier to conceptualize when you can break it down like this and just put it on paper and when you know where you're going. So I think sometimes because we tend to start with like wanting to I think it's okay to start having one-on-ones for the purpose of information gaining, but I think so many of us are like we start trying to do tactics before we actually have an idea of like what our big strategic approach is. So we're like, oh, we're collecting a bunch of petition signatures, which requires a bunch of resources and energy and capacity and hours, like volunteer hours or whatever, and maybe it's not even actually the tactic that's going to move the pillar that we need to move in order to achieve the goal that we need to achieve to move further towards our end outcome that we're trying to see. So it helps us work smarter, not harder. And like you were saying, Leslie, like if something's been tried before, part of our emergent strategy idea is the idea that it's iterative, right? So we will be trying things again. And it's like if we can learn that something was tried before, can we learn about the context that played into that and figure out, I wonder what made this not work. I wonder if there's things that we can change this time or if there's things that are different that could change the outcome of the situation and if it's worth repeating or if it's worth trying something new. I will update the strategy chart that I linked in the resources from last week with the new columns of questions. So last week we had the column with the questions for the goals. We had the column with the questions for the spectrum of supporters. And then this week I'll add the column for targets, aka pillars, and then the column for organizational considerations, aka like resources and costs. And we're going to get to tactics, which is that final column, in a later session. But wanted to just let you know that that'll be there, so if that you are trying to plug this in, Leslie or Hanaya, thinking about your own kind of issue and campaign trajectory, then that'll be updated. And I'll have, as usual, the slides, the recording uploaded tonight, along with some extra bonus readings and materials. And I'll try and put together a similar summary as I did last time of like, okay, so you're sitting down to think about this. Here's the steps that I would suggest for the approach. And if you have some time to give a couple of thoughts of feedback about, what you liked about tonight or what you feel like this live was lacking or something that you were hoping to learn that you didn't, feel free to drop that in the chat. But otherwise, we are almost 10 minutes over, so I'm going to let y'all run and return to the rest of your lives. And I'm going to go get my own kiddo bathed and ready for bed, and I will see y'all next week. Thanks so much for being here.
A wonderful night.
You too, Hanaya. Thank you.
you say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You can say bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh.
Bye, Chelsea. I'll see you soon.
See ya.
We'll talk soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tina.
Yeah, we're gonna turn.